Hello, everyone, and on behalf of the Office of Alumni Relations and Development and the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago, welcome. My name is Robert Deans. I'm a second year in the college majoring economics. Last quarter, I served as an IOP Fellows Ambassador to former Congressman Will Hurd of the Texas 23rd. Thank you for joining us for this virtual conversation between IOP Director David Axelrod and our distinguished guest and University of Chicago Law School alumna, Congresswoman Liz Cheney. Congresswoman Cheney is the at-large representative for Wyoming in the U.S. House of Representatives, holding the seat that her father, Vice President Dick Cheney, once held. She currently serves on the Armed Services Committee and the subcommittees for military personnel and strategic forces. Representative Cheney is the former chair of the House Republican Conference, the third-ranking leadership position in the House of Representatives for the Republican Party, and formerly served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs in the George W. Bush administration. A staunch conservative, Representative Cheney is an outspoken on her reverence for the rule of law and our Constitution, the need to restore America's power and strength around the world, and cutting taxes and regulations. David Axelrod will moderate this event. David is the founding director of the Institute of Politics, senior political commentator for CNN, and the host of the podcast The Axe Files and Hacks on Tap. David previously served as the chief strategist and senior advisor to President Barack Obama and spent 8 years as a reporter and columnist for the Chicago Tribune. We are honored to have Congresswoman Cheney join us for the last IOP Speaker Series event of the year. This past year, the IOP has welcomed nearly 100 speakers, hosted 14 fellows who led seminars for our students, provided funding for over 330 internships, and supported 6 student-led civic engagement programs. All of these programs are part of the IOP's mission to inspire the next generation of public service leaders. To learn more about the Institute, please check out politics.uchicago.edu. With that, I will turn it over to Congresswoman Cheney and Mr. Axelrod.
Thank you, Robert. Congresswoman Cheney, welcome. Welcome back to the University of Chicago. It's great to have you. What were you were here in the mid-90s in the law school. What drew you to the university in the first place, and what was your experience like here? What's the most memorable part of it?
Well, thank you first of all for having me, David. Thank you very much for your leadership in a whole range of areas, including the Institute of Politics now. My most memorable experience at the University of Chicago was having my first baby. Our oldest daughter was born 2 weeks before the end of my first year of law school, born there at the University of Chicago Hospital. And so that she's getting married this summer. So that tells you how long ago that was.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you. But no, it was a wonderful place. I actually applied to the law school and got in, and then deferred a couple of years because I was working at the Agency for International Development, and the wall had come down in 1989, and I was working in the bureau that was handling the programs to help privatize and encourage democracy, help build market economies in those countries that had been behind the Iron Curtain, and then in the former Soviet Union. And so the law school very nicely let me defer two times, and then I started in the fall of '93.
I just it strikes me as kind of ironic. I'm sure it strikes you as ironic that you're now probably very welcome and celebrated figure on campuses across the country. Cheney name has not been PC all the time in the last 2 decades. But tell me about a little bit about your upbringing. And your parents both were, speaking about not necessarily PC, they were 2 conservative PhD students at the University of Wisconsin in the late 60s. So that was unusual. And then they moved to Washington, and your dad at a very early age was the chief of staff to President Ford. You would have been a young person, very young person, 9-10 years old at that time. What do you recall of those years? And was it always just assumed in your head that someday I am going to serve, and someday I may go into politics myself?
Well, what I recall of the Ford years in particular, when my dad was the chief of staff, of course, as chief of staff, your hours are very long. And my sister and I were young, and he wanted to be able to spend as much time as he could with us. And so he would bring us down to the White House on the weekends. On Saturday mornings, we would go with him to his office in the West Wing, which is still the chief of staff's office to this day. And the height of technology in 1974, 1975 was that he had a wall that had multiple televisions in the wall. So you could put each one on a different network. And Mary and I would sit on the floor of his office in the West Wing and turn each television to a different cartoon show, because then you could only watch cartoons on Saturday mornings, and sit and watch multiple cartoons. The other thing was that for a while, his office, he was the deputy chief of staff when Don Rumsfeld was the chief of staff. And in those days, outside Don Rumsfeld's office, in one of his assistant's desk drawers, it was just a drawer full of candy. And so Mary and I would spend a lot of time surveying the candy in that drawer, and then go watch our cartoons. But I don't think I assumed, always that I would get involved in politics, but I certainly knew that what was happening, from a public affairs perspective, from a policy perspective, those were always topics we talked about at home around the dinner table. And so there were always things I was very interested in. And certainly watching both my parents be involved in careers that, let them engage in the important issues of the day, things that were sort of bigger than self, was inspirational. And so I think certainly that, plus the love of history that both my parents instilled in us, definitely informed my ultimate decisions about career path.
And your career, I mean, you point out early years at the State Department, at USAID, and then ran for office in Wyoming. And your rise in the House was very, very swift to the number 3 position in the House. Your release from that position was just as swift. And obviously you've been thrust into a great deal of controversy and debate about President Trump, what his role should be in the Republican Party, and about your own future. You're campaigning. I assume you're in Wyoming now.
I'm actually in DC now, but I just got back last night.
So tell me the reaction you've heard from your own constituents about the position you took on January 6th on President Trump, and about the decision of the House to dispatch you as the conference chair.
Well, it is, first of all, I think important to understand that Wyoming gave President Trump a larger margin of victory than any other state in the country, both in 2016 and in 2020. And the policies that President Trump pursued are policies that those of us in Wyoming support, and they're important policies in terms of deregulation and tax cuts, resources for a strong national defense. So we're a very conservative state. I'm a conservative Republican, but we are also a state that reveres the Constitution and understands and reveres the important role of the oath that we all take. Those of us who are serving in elected office, people who've served in a whole range of positions, we take that oath. And so as I talk to my constituents across Wyoming, certainly there are people who disagree with my vote to impeach. Certainly there are people who are angry, but there are also many, many people who express gratitude for putting the Constitution above politics, and recognize and understand how fragile our system is. And we're a small state population-wise, obviously a large state geographically, but serving the people of Wyoming and campaigning in Wyoming has always been very much characterized by talking to people individually, having the chance to really sit down and hear from people, hear their perspectives, explain my views and perspectives. And so I've been very inspired and heartened, frankly, by those discussions and conversations over the last, number of months now, certainly since January 6th and since the impeachment vote.
And we'll talk about your race out there in a bit. We all heard your statement when you stood on the floor of the House the day before the conference voted to relieve you of your position. It wasn't lost on me that most of your Republican colleagues left the floor when you took to the microphone. It felt a little like high school, or at least for me, it felt like high school, which says something about me. But what are those relationships like now between you and, because I get the sense that there are a lot of people there who probably agree with you, but find it inconvenient that you keep raising these points about January 6th and the way the president conducted himself.
Well, I would say a couple of things. When I spoke on the House floor, it was during a special order time. There wasn't sort of a mass exodus of members from the floor. It was much more sort of the natural flow of things. I think we're living through an unprecedented era. We're living through a moment in our politics that I don't think we've seen before. And a moment where you have a former president who refused to accept the fact that he lost the election, continues to refuse to accept the fact, provoked an attack on the Capitol while we were counting electoral votes, refused to send help when the attack was underway, and has continued to this day to use language that he knows provokes violence. And so I think it's a very consequential moment in our politics. And it's a time when there certainly are members, and I've had a number of members say things to me like, we would have voted to impeach, but we were concerned about our security. And I think that in some ways people have sort of glossed over that, but I think that's a very important point to pause and contemplate, that you have members of the United States House of Representatives for whom, security, their personal security or their family security, their concerns about that affected the way that they felt they could vote. That's a really significant thing to say about the current state of our politics.
Do you not have those concerns about your own security? You've been such a focus of attention and ugly attention in some quarters of social media. And what are your concerns for you and your family?
Well, I think certainly we all have those concerns. I think that what concerns me also, though, is the idea that my kids might grow up in a country that isn't characterized by the peaceful transition of power. And I realize that's also a very kind of a grave thing to say. But I did have a moment of realization after the 6th and after the impeachment vote, looking at that. Our two youngest are sons, and, looking at my boys at dinner one night and thinking, we grew up in a country where power transferred peacefully, where we could take that for granted, and wondering suddenly, are they going to grow up in a country where that isn't taken for granted, where that's not something they can count on? And I think all of us, no matter what our party affiliation is, have an obligation to defend that very most fundamental aspect of our republic. And I think that's very, very important.
Have you stepped up your own security, though, as a result of all of this?
I have. I don't want to get into details about it, but
sure,
it's certainly something we're all focused on.
You said the president still hasn't accepted his defeat. There were reports this week that he is thinking somehow he'll be reinstated by August. What do reports like that travel virally, what do they do to sort of gin up concern about political violence and some of the things that we saw on January 6th?
I think it's a very real threat, and it's an ongoing threat. And I think that President Trump's continued activities demonstrate the falsity of the idea that if we simply ignore him, he'll go away. There are some in my party who are embracing him. There are some who don't want to embrace him, who don't want him to be part of the future of the party or the country, but who think that we can get to that point by simply ignoring him. And I just don't believe that. I think that because he continues to pose the kind of threat that you've described, and because he is perpetuating a lie about the functioning of our electoral system that is toxic to the democracy, I believe as a party, and I believe as Americans and as elected officials, we have to stand against that. We have to tell people the truth, and we have to fight for the truth. And we've got to build our party back on a foundation that embraces the Constitution, embraces fidelity to the Constitution, and that we have to be very clear to say a president who did what Donald Trump did has no role to play in the future of the nation. He simply can't. It's too dangerous.
But and I'm sure you were told by your colleagues during this period that many of them, including Leader McCarthy, believe that they need Trump. Lindsey Graham said we can't move forward without him. That you need to placate Trump for the Republican Party to succeed. You obviously have a different view on that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that's wrong from a moral perspective. I think it's wrong from a constitutional perspective. As I said, when a president commits the kind of violations of his oath that Donald Trump did, he disqualifies himself. And so, from the perspective of what is right and wrong, he should not be part of our party or our national politics going forward.
Yeah, but what about the politics of it?
Yeah, and on the politics of it as well. When Donald Trump was president, we lost the House, the Senate, and the White House. And I think it's the only time, it was 100 years prior to that happened in a president's term in office. And so I think from a political perspective, it's also a mistake. And I think if you look at what the Republican Party has to do in order to be able to win elections, put in place the policies we believe in, we really do have to attract back voters who left us. We've got to attract back independents. We've got to be clear that, the voters who came to the party because of Donald Trump's policies, I think that it's very important for us not to be conveying the idea that we're rejecting those voters, because certainly we aren't. But I think it's important for us to say, we are rejecting what happened on the 6th and the president who provoked what happened on the 6th.
That's a very hard kind of balance to strike, because a majority of Republican voters agree with not what happened on the 6th, but they agree with his interpretation of the election. And I want to ask you about that, a little bit more about that in a second. But it struck me. Again, I as someone who cares deeply about this democracy, I was moved by your remarks, and but it struck me, if I as a caucus had made the decision that we were going to play along with Trump, then, and you're the conference chair in charge of the messaging of the conference, it was an untenable situation, wasn't it?
It became clear that to stay in leadership, I would have to be willing to perpetuate the lie, and I wasn't willing to do that. So it was untenable. That's absolutely right.
Did you actually have that conversation with McCarthy? Was it just that clear?
We did not have that conversation, but I think it became increasingly clear, when we had a press conference and I was asked whether or not President Trump should be prosecuted. And I said that was up to the Justice Department, but that I really think it's important for us to have a commission, a bipartisan commission, that looks at what happened in the lead up to January 6th, that looks at what caused it. I was taking a position that was very different from the one that Leader McCarthy, Whip Scalise had taken. But I believe it is the only position you can take in terms of what's right for the country, and understanding what happened on that day, understanding what caused the attack, and how we prevent it in the future.
And But my question to you, as a very pragmatic and smart politician, is, they were criticized, and I criticized them for their decision. But once they made the decision that they were going to play along on that and try and brush the events of the 6th under the rug, you were unviable for them.
I suppose that's right. And I think it's it's the wrong decision, not because of me, but again, for the party to be in a position
Yeah,
where,
they tied themselves to that position now.
yeah, I mean, and this isn't a policy disagreement. This is the president provoking an attack on the Capitol to prevent us from counting electoral votes. And both McCarthy and Scalise, certainly McCarthy, made clear that he understood that that's what had happened in his remarks on the floor on January 13th. So there was no question in the days after the attack what had happened. There was no question who was responsible then. But then, of course, Kevin McCarthy decided to go to Mar-a-Lago at the end of January. And I think that was a real moment where it became clear we weren't going to be able to move forward and focus on substance and policy, because we had leaders who were embracing the president who had just been impeached.
Did you know before he was going that he was going?
I didn't.
And what did you, I mean, what was your reaction when you saw the video on the screen?
I was stunned. I could not imagine any justification for doing that. And I asked him why he had done it, and he said, well, he had just been in the neighborhood essentially. But it's no, as I said, I think what Donald Trump did is the most dangerous thing, the most egregious violation of an oath of office of any president in our history. And so the idea that a few weeks after he did that, the leader of the Republicans in the House would be at Mar-a-Lago, essentially, pleading with him to somehow, come back into the fold, or whatever it was he was doing, to me was inexcusable.
And what was your conversation with him like after that? You must have confronted him on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I won't go into a lot of detail, but as I said, I asked him why he had done it, and his answer was unsatisfactory. But again, I don't think there was any answer he could have given, that
would have been
explained it.
Yeah. You must have seen Vice President Pence's comments the other night, which he said, I don't think we'll ever see eye to eye, he and President Trump, on the events of January 6th, but I'm proud of the 4 years record before that. Can you walk that line?
Look, I think that Vice President Pence deserves tremendous gratitude for the courage that he showed on January 6th. I know that he was under tremendous pressure, including on the day of January 6th, to discard electoral votes, to announce that he was rejecting slates of electors, to announce he was sending them back to state legislatures. He was under real pressure to act in a way that was unconstitutional, and he didn't do it. And when it became clear he wouldn't do it, as we all now know, President Trump sent a tweet out saying he didn't have the courage to do what was necessary, and that incited, sort of
Put a target on his back.
Attacks, right? So I think he deserves tremendous credit for standing firm. That
said, what I'm asking though, he clearly has some aspirations to maybe run for president himself. Can you say, I disagree with Donald Trump on January 6th, but I embrace everything else and move on and succeed? First of all, is that an intellectually sustainable position? And secondly, is it a politically sustainable position in this Republican Party? Do you have to choose on that?
Well, I mean, what I guess I'd say is my own personal view is that the issues between Election Day and January 6th and the way the president has conducted himself, President Trump, since then, they're not policy disputes, so I see it differently. I don't think this is something where you can act as though it's a policy dispute or a disagreement about what happened. You have a president who tried to steal the election. And when he wasn't able to, he exercised his legitimate rights through the court system. That was legitimate, and he had the right to do that. But when that failed, he then started trying to strong arm locally elected officials. They also, a number of them, deserve huge credit for not bowing to that pressure. And then when that failed, he, started telling everybody to come to DC on the 6th, that somehow they were going to change things then, and using language like it's a war and you need to fight to the death. So, I think it's very clear that the president violated the Constitution, violated his oath of office. I don't think that there's a disagreement there.
One thing when I heard his Vice President Pence's remarks that occurred to me was, and I want to ask you about this and your own thoughts on this. It wasn't just after the election that the president was casting doubt on the election. It was before the election as well. For months before the election, he was telling crowds of people that if we don't win, it will be a fraudulent election. What were you thinking when you heard those things? Because I know you spoke out on, I think, December 20th, which is when when the court cases were pretty much decided certification was going to happen, maybe did happen. But were you uncomfortable when you heard his remarks leading up to the election?
Yes, and there were a number of occasions where I spoke out with respect to things like guaranteeing the peaceful transition of power. Even before we got to the election, and then after the election, I did as well. But I think what he was doing, clearly, we, at the time, was wrong, and we now know how dangerous it was. And the other thing that occurs to me is when you listen to Donald Trump talk now, when you hear the language he's using now, it is essentially the same things that the Chinese Communist Party, for example, says about the United States and our democracy. And I think it's important for people to also stop and think about that for a moment. When he says that our system doesn't work, that our democratic process, when he suggests that it's incapable of conveying the will of the people, that somehow it's failed. Those are the same things that the Chinese government says about us, and it's very dangerous and damaging, and it's not true.
I want to ask this question without judgment, because you do represent a state that strongly supported President Trump, and as you point out, is quite conservative, and your voting record reflects that. You supported Trump's positions, I think 93% of the time, which really underscores the meaning of the decision to toss you out as conference chair. But after the last election in 2016, Trump contended that he had actually won the popular vote, which he had lost by 3 million, appointed a commission to find evidence of that, which they could not. And there were all kinds of incursions on, rule of law and other, with the, relative to the Department of Justice, relative to the FBI, certainly relative to the, there were concerns about his relationship with the intelligence community and so on. What were you thinking through all of that? I mean, and the reason I say I ask without judgment is because you're a practicing politician, and I have some sympathy for the pressures that entails. But I mean, how many times did you just bite your tongue and say, this is really off kilter, but I got to hold my fire here?
Well, I think if you go back and look, you'll see number of times that I spoke out. I remember when President Trump stood next to Vladimir Putin
Yes.
At that Helsinki press conference and
Yes.
suggested that he believed Putin over our own intelligence agencies.
Yes, and you made a very strong statement then.
Yeah, and so there were a number of occasions where I did speak out when President Trump announced that he was going to essentially order all states to take action with respect to, I think that was in connection with COVID, actually, that he was going, he himself had the authority to order all of the states to do X, Y, or Z.
Mhm.
And I spoke out then and said, no, that is not how the Constitution works in this regard. And so I think that there were a number of cases, certainly a number of instances over the course of his presidency where I disagreed, and I spoke out about those. There were a number of places where the policies were good, and I supported those. And I think one of those, for example, is what he did to provide resources for the Defense Department. I think that was
Mhm.
really crucial. And so I think, from a policy perspective, you can go back and say, here's where we agreed and here's where we disagreed. Once you get into the fundamental attacks on the electoral process, and then what happened on January 6th, that's nothing to do with policy, and
Yeah, right. But like the commission back in 2017 had nothing to do with policy. That was a piece of what we saw evolve on January 6th. So, and you knew that. I mean, you knew that it was crazy to suggest that 3 million votes, the 3 million vote margin was somehow fraudulent. You knew that then.
But I think that what we are dealing with now, and what we saw with respect to the violence in the aftermath of the 2020 election, um, you know, uh, is something that reaches new levels of danger for the nation. And you'll appreciate, I'm sure, David, one of the ways that I explain my vote to my constituents is, I say to them, you need to imagine if it were Barack Obama doing these things. If it were Barack Obama who, had stolen the election, had tried to steal the election, had been pressuring local Democratic officials to change results and to find votes. That's how we need to think about this.
Yeah. As you mentioned earlier, I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of the majority of Republicans have accepted the story that the election was fraudulent, and this has given rise to all over the country initiatives by state legislatures to restrict in different ways voting in the states. And when you ask the supporters of these propositions why they're doing it, there's no particular incident of fraud that they point to, because in most of the states, these elections were certifiably good and honest. And so they say, well, it's because people have doubts about the election process. So it's kind of a weird thing, isn't it, where you say, where you perpetuate a fraud and then you legislate to deal with the fraudulent facts that you've propagated out there.
Well, look, I think several things I would say. One is that all of the laws that we're seeing now that have been passed in a number of states, it's wrong to lump them all together. It's wrong to say, that these laws are, by definition, meant as some perpetuation of this broader claim that President Trump is making. And I'm sure that they'll be tested in court, and courts will decide, in each case, whether or not those laws, can stand. And I think that's important. I think you can't sit back and say, because, the legislators in some state decide that they want to put restrictions or, make new rules about mail-in voting or absentee voting, that by definition that is, an attempt at voter suppression. I think we have to be responsible at analyzing the pieces of each one of those laws. And it's certainly true there was fraud in the election. There's fraud in every election. And so I don't think, we certainly can't say this was a perfect election or that it was free of fraud. We know that the fraud that President Trump alleged, he was unable to prove. And, in every 62 different courts, including judges he appointed, rejected his claims. So I think we have to be clear that we're going to abide by the rule of law, and that applies to the new election laws that are being passed now as well.
But it is unhealthy for a democracy if large numbers of people think that the election process was not free and fair and honest.
Well, and that is a really important point. I think, and that's a point about what is our job as elected leaders. And too many of my colleagues take the approach of saying, well, vast numbers of Republicans believe this, as though our actions don't have any impact on that. And I think all of us, Republicans and Democrats, and the news media, have an obligation to tell people the truth, have an obligation to say to people, listen, this is what happened. This is the reality of what happened. Looking for ways, for example, if you look at the audit, the so-called audit, which isn't really an audit, that's going on now in Maricopa County, Arizona, people need to know the truth about that. They need to know the truth about how many times those ballots have been counted and recounted. And the fact that the company that's been hired to do it now has never done this before. It's a fraudulent audit. And I think it's important and incumbent upon those of us who are elected to recognize that we have the ability and the responsibility to impact what people believe, and making sure people have the truth. We have to tell people the truth. And simply saying the majority of Republicans believe the election was stolen, to me, that says we aren't doing our job well enough to make sure people have the facts to understand it wasn't stolen. And we don't like the outcome, but that doesn't mean it wasn't stolen, or that doesn't mean it was stolen.
Yeah, one good quick question about the first impeachment, which you opposed. Did you have concerns about the call that the president made to the president of Ukraine? I was trying to imagine Vice President Dick Cheney picking up the phone in 2003 and calling a foreign leader and asking them to open up a investigation on John Kerry. I mean, it wouldn't have. That would be inconceivable to me.
I did have concerns about it. And I think that if you look, though, at what the Democrats, the path that the Democrats pursued, again, impeachment is a really serious and grave step. And as we watched that impeachment trial unfold, as we watched the witnesses the Democrats called, they didn't prove the case. And, they should have pursued the subpoenas. They should have been in a position, frankly, where if they were going to make these claims, if they were going to make these charges, they needed to prove the case. And I looked very carefully. I read the depositions. I watched the testimony. You can't impeach a president because somebody said they heard somebody else say something. You have to prove your case. And so to me, that impeachment was very different than the impeachment for the activities leading up to and on January 6th.
Do you think that impeachment acquittal emboldened Trump?
I hate to, I don't think I could, sort of get inside his mind on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting place to be. You did, there were several places in which you have taken the president on, as you mentioned, and one of them was around the whole issue of the handling of the pandemic. And you tweeted this tweet of your dad wearing a mask, and it said, "Real men wear masks." And it was a very clear message about that. Help me understand how masks and vaccinations have become such a cultural and political flashpoint in our politics. And I'm sure you hear it in your own state as you move around.
Well, it's really too bad. Masks and vaccines shouldn't be political. And as we dealt with the pandemic over the course of the last year, there were many debates about what the right approach was. We had many different states that handled the pandemic differently. But none of that should have been political. And I think that, I think President Trump's mishandling of the pandemic is going to be part of his legacy. And, it should not have gotten to the point that it did. I think that one of the real, innovative successes, obviously, that we've seen and that the Trump administration deserves credit for, the development of the vaccines.
Mhm.
So I think it's mixed. I think this is a place where Vice President Pence deserves credit again, for his handling of the task force. Um, but it should never have been a political issue whether somebody put a mask on or not.
Another point in which you differed was with these attacks on Dr. Fauci, who you defended. Was a medal. He received the Medal of Freedom from President Bush for his work on the AIDS epidemic. Tell me what you think about what's going on right now. The emails surfaced that raised questions about whether he was aggressive enough about this theory, which is still a theory about where the virus started, whether it was from a lab or from a bat jumping to humans. Have you changed your thinking at all about Dr. Fauci?
I haven't. Dr. Fauci is somebody I've known for many years. I stand by my support for him. I think that you've got some of the same people now who are insistent on an investigation into the origins of COVID, which I support. I think that's very important. I think we need to have that. But there's some of the same people who denied that COVID was even a problem, a year ago. And so I think there's, again, a lot of politicization that's gone on. And I think it's important for us to look back at the management of the pandemic, to understand what went right and what went wrong, to learn from it. But I remain a supporter of Dr. Fauci and the work he's done for the country throughout his career, including over the course of the last year.
You talked earlier about the peaceful transition of power. I have to tell you that I was in awe of the level of cooperation and help that we got from President Bush in the transition 2008. And as you are well aware, it wasn't because he loved everything we said in that campaign. I'm pretty certain of that.
I'm sure that's right.
But he felt that he, as a trustee of our democracy, had an obligation to see to that there was a good and peaceful transfer of power. He was very personally encouraging to some of us, which is something I will never forget. Now, 4 years later, not only do we not have that, but you were chastised online and in various precincts for simply greeting the President of the United States in April at his speech to a joint session of Congress. How does a democracy function if we can't even acknowledge our own, our respective humanity, and if we begin from the assumption that if you disagree with me, you're not as much of an American as I am?
I think it's a problem. I think if you look at the set of challenges and threats that we're facing as a country, whether you're talking about the global threats from China, from Russia, Iran, North Korea, whether you're talking about the economic challenges, the spending, what we're facing domestically, recovering from COVID. These are really serious issues, and they require a seriousness of purpose and a commitment to substance in order to be able to deal with them effectively. And too often now we have incentivized people to get involved in politics, incentivized the wrong people, or encouraged people who come to Washington and decide they want to be social media stars and they don't really want to do the hard work. And I think that's a place where, in both parties, all of us as voters have an obligation to support people who are serious and to recognize there are big policy divides, big things we disagree on. We ought to, debate, discuss, fight those out, and then, recognize, as you said, that we're not enemies. We're opponents in some cases. Some cases we'll be able to work together on things. But the challenges we face are too serious to have people who aren't serious, in the lead of dealing with
just
them.
on that point, what was stunning to a lot of us was when the caucus met, and on the same day they did nothing about Marjorie Taylor Greene and some of her outrageous comments, but they voted on whether you should remain as conference chair. What should, now we've seen additional, and you've been outspoken about it, her comparing being asked to wear a mask on the House floor to the Holocaust. What should the Republican conference do about her? Should there not be some action taken on the part of the conference itself? Adam Kinzinger suggested she should be expelled from the conference.
Look, I think that the conference and the party has to be very clear. Leader McCarthy likes to talk about a big tent, and I think that's important. We want to have a big tent, but no tent should be big enough that it includes anti-Semites, racists, bigots. We have members of, at least one member of the House Republican Conference who continues to appear at white nationalist events. And I've spoken out against him. And I think those views, people who espouse them, they just have no place in our party. They should have no place in our politics. I think the same is true for members of the Democratic caucus, members like Ilhan Omar. And I think the Democrats ought to be responsible for members in their caucus who also have engaged in speech that has no place in our public discourse. So I think this is one place that again, it's connected to January 6th. When you look at the symbols of white supremacy, the fact that a Confederate flag flew in the Capitol that day, the fact that you had Holocaust deniers, you had the symbols and the insignia of those things with the people, on the people who invaded the Capitol. I think our party has to be very clear that that's not who we are. We reject that. We stand against it. We will fight against it. And people who espouse those views don't have a place in our party. Our tent cannot be that big. We must draw the line.
You've got a tough race coming up next year. President Trump has made it clear that he wants to target you, and you've got 8 opponents now. There may be more or less come next year. But assuming that you navigate that rocky terrain, that I know you've been asked about this notion as to whether you would run for president in 2024. I don't expect you to answer that here, but you haven't ruled it out either. And I'm wondering what would provoke you to even consider that in 2024?
Well, I am certainly focused, as you won't be surprised, on my reelection.
As you should be.
Yeah. And I think, it's the race, particularly my primary race, is going to be unlike, I think, any House primary that we've seen certainly in a long time, because the fundamental issue, the question at the heart of my primary race will be, assuming Donald Trump endorses somebody, which I assume he will, it'll be a choice for the voters of Wyoming between a candidate who's pledged loyalty to Donald Trump, loyalty to one man, and me, who has demonstrated loyalty to the people of Wyoming, loyalty to the Constitution above all. And I think it will be a very clear message for the rest of the country about where the Republican Party is. It's an opportunity for the voters of Wyoming to send a clear message about rebuilding our party on a foundation of truth and on a foundation of principles of adherence to the rule of law and to the Constitution. And so I think it's a very important race. Obviously, if I weren't in it, I would think that, but I think it's really a race where we're going to send a message to the rest of the country, and I'm excited about it. I am prepared to. We'll fight very hard and expect that I'll be able to prevail.
I knew you were too good to answer that question. And if I were advising you, I would have advised you to answer it just as you did. We do have questions for you, Congresswoman, and the first one comes from a student. Andre, you want to step forward?
Sure. Hello, Congresswoman. How are you doing? My name's Andre Noel. I'm a second-year MPP at the Harris School. And my question sort of concerns, I mean, we've talked all about this political chaos, this hyperpartisanship that's really grappling our country right now. But what does that hyperpartisanship mean for our national security interests and our credibility in terms of foreign policy, our ability to deal multilaterally and even bilaterally with allies and so on, when we sort of see, a swaying between the two political parties every 4 or 8 years?
Well, it's a great question, Andre. I think, the rest of the world has gotten accustomed to the fact that we do have this, every 4 years, every 8 years, we change, potentially we change parties in charge. I think what's different right now, and I know this from hearing from friends of mine who are in governments overseas or who used to be in governments overseas, that watching what happened on the 6th and sort of watching where the United States is today politically, I think it worries people. I think they don't like it if it seems like the United States has lost its footing with respect to democracy. We haven't lost our footing, but we've got to make sure we don't, and we have to fight for it. And we have to be able to say to people around the world, particularly as we are engaged in what is going to be, at least a generational contest with great powers and the Chinese government in particular, we have to be able to demonstrate our strength and the strength of our values, the strength of our democracy. And I think that is something that is even more important coming out of the last election. Another reason why we've got to make sure that we get back to having our debates about policy and substance, and not this kind of fundamental attack on the foundations of the country that we've seen from Donald Trump.
Thank you.
We have an alum, Kwame, you want to step up? Or I guess I'm reading this question. And I'm actually going to alter it a bit because I think you answered it earlier, but how do you see the current state level efforts to restrict access to voting? Congresswoman, let me take it to a different place, which is, shouldn't our goal be in demonstrating the strength of our democracy to ensure that the largest number of people who are eligible to vote, obviously, but participate in our elections, that the more people participate in our elections, including the huge number that participated in this last election, the more vibrant and healthy our democracy is?
I think that's right. I think we should. I think we want to make sure that everybody who is qualified to vote can. And I think that's important. I think that there are some basic things we ought to be doing, though. I believe we ought to have IDs. I think people should have to show an ID to vote. One of my very first experiences as a poll watcher, David, was actually on the south side of Chicago when I was in law school, and I volunteered for the Cook County Republican Party as a poll watcher. It must have been the '94 elections. And I was the only Republican at this location where I had been sent. And I can tell you the other people who were there had been doing this for a long time. It was a mental institution. And the voters who came in to vote, were taken behind the box, were taken basically into the ballot box, into the voting booth by people who were voting for them. And that should not have been going on. So, I've seen firsthand the kind of fraud that happens. And I think that we all ought to be committed to making sure everybody who's legally eligible to vote does, but that those people who aren't, that we do everything we can to prevent fraudulent voting.
Do you see a lot of that in Wyoming?
No, I don't. I think that part of what we have that's really, I think, a benefit of our system is that it's not a national system, that we have our, individual states responsible for their elections. We've been, very, very blessed in Wyoming, both at our county level and with our Secretary of State throughout the course of the number of years. And our elections work well there. One of the
I only ask because they just passed a voter ID law there.
Yeah.
And so if there's no problem, I'm wondering what problem you're solving for.
I guess I don't understand why people shouldn't have to show ID to vote. I mean, it seems to me, you have to show ID to get on an airplane. You have to show ID, in sometimes in the summer, we like to go to church at the Chapel of the Transfiguration, which is actually in the park. And so you have to show ID to get to church because you got to show ID to get into the park. And it just occurs to me, I don't know why you wouldn't have to show ID to vote.
Um, I have another question from an alum, Eunice, on it's bad for democracy to have the Republican Party taken over by an irrational faction. What is the hope for our two-party structure? Is now the time for a viable third party? Since you're running to be the nominee of a second party, probably not the best question to ask, but go ahead.
I'm gonna challenge the underlying assumption of your question there, but I don't look. I am firmly committed to rebuilding the Republican Party. I think the first part of the question is right. That we cannot have a party that's built around a cult of personality, and I think that's bad for the country. And I think the Republican Party. I think we're the third oldest political party maybe in the world, and have an unbelievably proud and honorable tradition as the party of Lincoln. And the way we win elections is on substance and policy and ideas, and that's what we have to get back to. And I think we will be condemning ourselves to losing a lot of elections if we don't clearly condemn what happened and embrace the Constitution as we're bound to do.
And we have a final question from Sophie Hare, a student in the college, and she's, I think, with us on screen.
Hello, hi, Representative Cheney. My name is Sophie. I'm a second year in the college. I've watched as you took a principled stand and paid a high price. And I guess as a student who's looking to head to Washington when she graduates, I'm curious if you think it's still possible to be principled and effective as a legislator in DC.
Well, I do, and I think the country requires it. And I know a lot of principled and effective legislators on both sides of the aisle in Washington. They don't always get the attention that some of the unprincipled people do, but the vast majority of our elected officials really are in office for the right reasons. They really do want to do what's right for their constituents and help to make the country better. But I would also say our system depends upon the character of the people we elect. And so young people like yourself getting engaged and getting involved really matters. I think we've seen that our system can be fragile, and it really depends upon goodwill and character and principle of people who are in office. So I hope that you will be encouraged to participate, whether it's running for office or coming to work in Washington in public policy.
Thanks, Sophie. Representative Cheney, so happy that you could join today. We don't see all that many examples of people who are willing to risk their political neck for principles. And that's why what you did and what you've done since January 6th has stood out. I don't want to say more than that because I don't want to destroy your political future in Wyoming. But I, as an American, I do appreciate it. And as someone who loves this democracy, I appreciate it. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for being at the Institute of Politics. Thank you for speaking to our alums today, and good luck in the future.
Well, thank you. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that when I was at the University of Chicago Law School, there were two professors there. One was named Barack Obama and one was named Elena Kagan. And I didn't have President Obama as a professor, but I did take civil procedure from Elena Kagan, and loved her as a professor because she didn't let politics into the law school classroom. So it was a wonderful place to be and really formative experience, and really enjoyed being with you today. So thanks.
Well, you're welcome. Think of how history could have changed if you had had Professor Obama.
I don't think it would have been good, David.
Good to be with you.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.